In our previous episode, we explored the similarities between two men recruited 44 years apart inside Opus Dei. And today, we're shifting our focus to a completely different perspective, but one that is, honestly, just as harrowing.
Yeah.
Welcome back to Voices After Silence. One of the unexpected things about making this podcast is that listeners often connect episodes that we never planned to connect. Sometimes people who never met each other, living in different places in different times, end up describing remarkably similar experiences. The more we looked at those stories, the more they seemed to be asking the same question. So tonight, we're going to follow that question wherever it leads.
Yeah, and it's really a question that forces us to look under the floorboards of these organizations, like the ones that claim some sort of divine mandate. We're really looking at the fundamental machinery of human conformity.
Swore I'd leave this town. Funny how it never left me. Life looks different in a back row rear view. Things I thought I wanted, some I did, some I outgrew. Count my blessings on the center line.
We are looking at the testimony of Anmarie Allen.
Right.
She's an Irish author, a former member of this conservative Catholic organization. And her story really centers on what it was like to be brought in as a 15-year-old girl in 1978.
Yeah.
She was brought into what they internally called an assistant numerary.
Right, or the derogatory term they used, a knack.
Exactly, a knack. And, we have her detailed accounts, her memoir, her inclusion in that major Financial Times investigation. And the goal today is to really examine this journey from, a vulnerable teenager to someone fighting for freedom and accountability.
And I think it's important to set the analytical tone right up front here, because this isn't just about understanding one woman's immense personal suffering, though that is, of course, central to it.
Right.
It's really about dissecting the architecture of systemic exploitation. We're looking at forced unpaid labor, severe psychological coercion, and all of it hidden behind this very polished guise of religious devotion.
Yeah, that's exactly it. And I think to start, we have to look at the on-ramp. Like, how does a 15-year-old girl actually get drawn into a system like this in the first place?
Well, you have to look at the environment, right?
Yeah, because from the outside looking back, it seems almost impossible. Like, how does a family just hand over their daughter? But Anmarie is very candid about her background. She was born in the UK, moved to Ireland when she was 8, and she notes that there was some dysfunction in her family.
Yeah.
She actually says the organization, quote, sniffed that out.
Which is such a chilling phrase.
It really is.
But what's fascinating here is that to understand why that approach worked so flawlessly, you really have to ground yourself in the socioeconomic reality of Ireland in the late 1970s.
Right. It was a completely different world.
Completely. I mean, unemployment was just staggering. Mass immigration was tearing communities apart. You had young people fleeing to the UK, to America, to Canada, basically just to survive. There was this grinding, everyday anxiety about the future.
So when these recruiters approached Anmarie's family, they didn't lead with a pitch about lifelong servitude or, religious vows.
Oh, not at all. No, they offered a perfectly calibrated secular illusion.
Yeah.
They pitched a catering course in Bellon in County Galway.
Right.
And they promised her parents that she would get this massive qualification, guaranteed employment in Ireland, which was huge.
It's a golden ticket right there.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And even pocket money of £5 a week.
Yeah.
So for a family dealing with economic anxiety in that climate, it was an irresistible proposition.
And the recruiters themselves, she describes them as incredibly articulate, impeccably presented, and there's this process she later recognized as love bombing, right?
Classic love bombing.
They were showering this teenager with compliments about her personality, her smile. And she says, she had never been spoken to with that level of focused, admiring attention.
Which, for a teenager from a slightly dysfunctional background, is intoxicating.
Exactly. Okay, let's unpack this for a second, because it says like a predatory talent scout. A scout who ignores the wealthy kids and goes straight for the kid from the broken home because they know that kid is hungry for a way out.
That's a really apt analogy.
Right. They didn't just recruit Anmarie, they recruited her parents' anxieties about the economy. And actually, as I saw in the source material, their moral anxieties too.
Oh, the moral aspect was the clincher.
But I have to push back here, or at least play devil's advocate. I'm trying to put myself in the parents' shoes. Even if the recruiters are charming and the economy is bad, you are still dropping your teenage daughter off at a residential facility. How do you not see the red flags?
Well, that is where the concept of information control comes in. It's a core component of the BITE model.
The bite model.
Yeah, behavior, information, thought, and emotional control. It's the framework used to understand how authoritarian groups operate. The recruiters didn't just, hide the red flags. They constructed a highly curated facade that was specifically designed to bypass the parents' natural protective instincts.
Is that what the whole thing with the house visit was about?
Exactly.
Because the detail about the television really, really stood out to me.
It's the perfect example of this tactic. So when the parents visited the facility, they were immediately struck by how pristine it was. But the defining prop, the psychological prop, was this television.
Right.
It was locked inside a cupboard, and the key had this little gold tassel on it. And the recruiters very proudly explained that they kept it locked so the girls wouldn't be exposed to, quote, immoral programs.
Like the soap opera Dallas, I think she mentioned.
Yes, exactly like Dallas.
So to a conservative Catholic parent in 1970s Ireland, that locked cupboard isn't a sign of imprisonment or control.
Not at all. To them, it's a sign of ultimate safety. It signals purity. It signals strict moral boundaries. The recruiters basically hijacked the parents' inherent trust in Catholic institutions
Right. They bypassed the parents' radar entirely.
by presenting themselves as these ultimate moral guardians. So the parents drive away, fully believing they are leaving their daughter in the safest place on earth.
Wow. But the reality, and this is October 1978, by the way, right around the time Pope John Paul II was elected, which is just a wild historical backdrop for this.
It really is.
The reality is that once those parents were out of sight, that illusion of a catering course vanished instantly.
Instantly.
The very same evening.
I read that there was literally no curriculum, no tutors for cookery, no history of past graduating classes, no awards on the walls.
Because there were no graduates. People either fled when they realized what it was, or they were absorbed into the workforce. So instead of a classroom, Anmarie was dropped into what was effectively a strict class-based labor camp.
Her quote-unquote education was just 13-hour workdays from 8:00 a.m. to 9:00 p.m., providing free domestic labor.
Before we go further into the labor aspect, I need you to clarify something from the source material because the terminology can get confusing.
Sure.
The text throws around terms like numerary and assistant numerary. Anmarie was brought in to be an assistant numerary. Can you break down this internal hierarchy? Because understanding the power dynamic seems crucial to everything that happens next.
It is entirely crucial. The organization operates on a very rigid caste system.
Okay.
At the top of the daily operational hierarchy inside the centers, you have the numeraries. These are typically university-educated, middle to upper-class members. They commit to celibacy, they live in the centers, and they often hand over their entire professional salaries to the organization.
Okay, so they are the professionals, the managers, basically.
Exactly. And then you also have supernumeraries who are usually married, live in their own homes, and contribute financially.
So where do the assistant numeraries fit in, like Anmarie?
They are the bottom of the pyramid. Right.
And this role is exclusively female. They are recruited specifically to perform all the manual domestic labor, the cooking, the cleaning, the laundry, for the centers, and for the male residences.
And they're celibate too, right?
Yes, they're celibate, they live in the centers, but they do not hold outside professional jobs. They are full-time, unpaid domestic servants to the upper tiers.
Here's where it gets really interesting to me, because that structural inequality makes the physical segregation Anmarie describes make terrible sense. She talks about the intense classism of the environment. You had the numeraries dining with silver platters, silver teapots, Waterford glass butter dishes.
Or best of everything.
Right. And meanwhile, Anmarie and the other teenagers in this course were sent to a dingy room, literally eating the scraped leftovers of the numeraries out of plastic containers.
Yeah.
How does an organization that preaches divine love and spiritual perfection justify feeding teenage girls leftovers out of plastic containers?
Yeah.
It feels less like a religious order and more like a feudal caste system. Well, you just hit the nail on the head. They justify it through ideological dehumanization.
Okay.
This actually traces back to the founder, Josemaria Escrivá. He mandated that assistant numeraries should never be left alone because, in his words, they have their own mentality.
Wow. Their own mentality. That is so condescending.
It's incredibly condescending. Inside the organization, these girls were viewed through this deeply derogatory lens. They were seen as uneducated, rough around the edges, inherently lesser. As you mentioned earlier, they were called horrible names behind their backs: muck savages, culties, bad apples.
So if you convince yourself that someone is inherently inferior, you create a moral loophole to exploit them.
Exactly. If we connect this to historical systems of subjugation, it's the same playbook. You establish a structured hierarchy of human value, and if their lower status is framed as something ordained by God, then their servitude is reframed as a spiritual favor you are doing for them.
Right, like you're elevating them through work.
Exactly. The justification for their servitude was literally, but we saved their souls. It allows the upper class, the Numeraries, to benefit from forced labor without experiencing any cognitive dissonance or guilt.
That is just incredibly dark. And to maintain that kind of feudal control over a teenager, you'd have to completely sever their ties to the outside world, right? Which brings us to the mechanics of her isolation.
The physical environment.
Yeah, she was transferred to a male student residence called Gerthard, and they took her there in this green bus they nicknamed Betsy.
Right.
The physical security of this place sounds unbelievable. Anmarie actually later worked in a state prison for 30 years, and she said the locking system keeping the women separated from the men in this religious residence was more sophisticated than what she saw in an actual penitentiary.
Which is a staggering comparison. But the physical environment was engineered to be an instrument of total control.
Double locks on everything.
Double locks on the doors. The directors held all the keys. And the movements between the male and female sections of the building were tightly coordinated by phone calls.
Just to make sure they never crossed paths.
Exactly. To ensure the women never, ever interacted with the men they were serving.
And even if they did accidentally cross paths, the silence protocols were absolute. The men were instructed never to look at the women, never to speak to them, not even a thank you.
Right.
There is this moment, Anmarie recalls, where a male student accidentally opened a door while she and a female numerary were in a hallway, and the female numerary completely panicked.
Like it was an emergency.
Yeah, as if a bomb had gone off.
Well, that panic illustrates how deeply ingrained the segregation was. It wasn't just a rule you followed. It was treated as a matter of spiritual life and death.
And inside this maximum security facility, the labor was just grueling. I mean, we are talking about teenage girls lugging massive hoovers and heavy buckets of water up back staircases in total silence.
All day.
All day. They washed the men's laundry, 7 shirts, 7 pairs of socks, 7 underpants per man. They had to iron shirts in exactly 3 minutes, using this very specific 3 fingers folding technique.
The micromanagement is intense.
It's obsessive. But, you know, sheer physical exhaustion doesn't entirely explain how a student fully transitions into a lifelong devoted member. I was reading the timeline in the source material, and there's a specific incident at age 15 that seemed to lock her in. This fabricated crisis.
Yes. The manufactured crisis.
Well, tell me about that.
To push Anmarie from being just an overwhelmed teenager into actually taking the vows of an assistant numerary, they needed a psychological catalyst.
Okay.
So things had gone missing in the college. And the directors pointed the finger directly at 15-year-old Anmarie.
Out of nowhere.
Out of nowhere.
Yeah.
A numerary told her they had received a letter from her parish priest back in her home village stating she was a well-known thief.
Which was a complete lie, right?
A total fabrication. Anmarie actually checked with that priest years later, and he had written the exact opposite. He wrote that she came from a good family and they should look after her.
Wow.
But you have to look at the mechanics of why a lie like that is deployed in that specific moment.
Let's break that down, actually. Because she didn't have a phone to call her parents, she couldn't verify the claim. But why wouldn't she just get angry and storm out? Why did this lie make her stay and submit?
Because of the trauma response it triggered. When you are 15 years old, isolated, exhausted, and suddenly accused of a shameful crime by the only authority figures in your life, the people who control your food and shelter, your brain often bypasses fight or flight and goes straight into fawn.
Fawning. That's when you try to appease your abuser to stay safe.
Precisely. By creating this crisis and threatening to send her home in disgrace, they completely stripped her of her psychological safety.
Right.
They made her feel entirely isolated and guilty, and in doing so, they conveniently positioned themselves as her only source of salvation.
Oh, I see.
Right. From the moment they dropped that accusation, they isolated her from her peers, they took her on special walks, and they accelerated her recruitment. And within 8 weeks of that accusation, she had officially joined.
Wow.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, Creating a crisis is a textbook manipulation tactic in high-control groups. By stripping her of her allies and accusing her of a crime, they made themselves her only lifeline.
And once she was fully in, the sheer volume of labor combined with that total isolation inevitably began to break down the bodies and minds of these young women. I mean, the physical injuries she describes are horrific.
Yeah, the physical toll was devastating.
She talked about walking on her knees to make the beds, which bizarrely always had to be made in odd numbers, like 1, 3, or 5 beds per room.
The arbitrary rules again.
Yeah. And she had to brush the stair carpets by hand on her knees, ensuring the fringes were perfectly straight. And this resulted in untreated fluid on her knees and lifelong rheumatoid arthritis.
From the time she was a teenager.
Yes. And there was an incident with caustic soda.
Yeah. While unblocking drains, caustic soda splashed into her face and literally burned a hole in her eye.
Oh my God.
And at another point, 5 of these young women spent 3 entire days on their knees, scraping varnish-off floors with actual knives simply because the center refused to pay for a sanding machine.
That is just needless suffering.
It is. By the time she was 16, she had severe shingles. She developed painful nasal and mouth ulcers purely from the chronic stress.
So what does this all mean? How does a 16-year-old endure shingles, arthritis, and literal self-harm without snapping? Because the source material mentions a Cilice.
Yes.
And the idea of giving this to a child is staggering to me. Can you explain what a Cilice is in this context?
A Cilice is a spiked metal chain. It's typically worn tightly around the thigh, and it's designed to cause pain and discomfort as a form of physical mortification. It's supposed to be a way to share in the suffering of Christ.
So they gave this to a 16-year-old.
Yes, Anmarie was given this spiked chain and a whip at age 16 and instructed to wear the Cilice for a minimum of 2 hours a day.
While she was carrying buckets of water and vacuum cleaners upstairs.
While doing heavy manual labor.
I struggle to wrap my head around that. But what makes this even more disturbing is the contrast Anmarie points out in her testimony regarding the men.
The health of the men.
Yeah. She noted the sharp difference between the health of the women and the health of the young men they were serving. She said the men seemed constantly unwell, but in a very, very catered way.
Pampered, almost.
Right. They required special diets. They had pill boxes at every meal. There is a mention of LC sheets. What are those?
LC sheets referred to lightly catered or special sheets required for young men who supposedly had sensitive skin conditions.
So let me get this straight. If a male student has a minor skin rash, he gets special luxury linens managed by a fleet of unpaid teenage servants. But if a 16-year-old servant develops severe shingles from stress, she is denied basic medical rest and told to strap a spiked metal chain to her leg.
That contrast perfectly encapsulates the institutional dynamic. The men's minor ailments were accommodated with the utmost care, while the bodies of the female servants were treated as entirely disposable.
And their minds were policed just as harshly. The weekly spiritual direction chats were less about spiritual growth and more about interrogating these young women about impure thoughts.
Constantly monitoring them.
Yeah. Anmarie said she was spied on, her mail was read, her room was searched, her phone calls were actively monitored. How does someone function under that level of surveillance while working 13-hour days?
Well, they barely function. And that is the point. Operating on 13-hour workdays with 0 sleep-ins destroys cognitive function. The text actually points out the similarity to military interrogation techniques.
Like sleep deprivation.
Exactly. When you deprive a person of sleep over long periods, the prefrontal cortex, the part of the brain responsible for logical reasoning and critical thinking, it basically shuts down.
So you can't even process how bad things are.
Right. Emotional regulation vanishes. The victim becomes highly pliable. They are entirely unable to mount a defense against psychological manipulation, let alone plan an escape.
They literally lack the cognitive resources to recognize the abuse.
Exactly.
But eventually, she did reach a breaking point. Despite all that total control, external realities started to pierce the bubble. And this led to a very dramatic exit.
Yes, the outside world started bleeding in.
What were the triggers for that? Because I know it wasn't just one thing.
It was a combination of things. First, in 1981, Cardinal Basil Hume in the UK issued a strict diktat stating that the organization was not to recruit minors.
Okay, so a high-level church official stepping in.
Right. And this was covered in the media. Anmarie's aunt in the UK happened to hear about it, and she tipped off Anmarie's father. That external validation was the first thing that alerted him to the reality of what was happening.
And internally, the illusion was shattering for Anmarie as well. The Stardust Fire tragedy in Ireland in 1981 seems to be a huge turning point.
Terrible, terrible tragedy.
For our listeners who might not know, 43 young people died in a horrific nightclub fire in Dublin. Anmarie was grieving this national tragedy like everyone else in Ireland, but she overheard the Numeraries cruelly judging the victims.
Yes.
They were saying these kids were out late, committing mortal sins, and they wouldn't go to heaven. Anmarie says that total lack of basic human empathy was the moment the penny dropped for her.
It was a massive crack in their moral authority. But, realizing you were in a trap is very different from escaping it.
Oh, absolutely.
Because when her father started demanding she come home, the institution deployed extreme psychological warfare to keep her.
I read about the staged visit with a bishop.
Oh, the coaching?
Yeah, Anmarie was so stressed before the bishop arrived that she broke out in a full-body rash.
Yeah.
And the Numeraries pulled her into a room and coached her for 2 solid days on exactly what words to say to him, just to ensure she painted this perfect, happy picture of her vocation.
They couldn't let the bishop see the reality. And the psychological warfare with her family was even worse.
The phone call with her mother.
Yes. When her parents called demanding she return, the control tactics escalated to an almost surreal level. Anmarie recalls being on the phone with her mother, and the directors literally surrounded her in a physical circle, aggressively praying the rosary out loud.
While she's on the phone.
While she's on the phone, and she knew other directors were listening outside the door. So, terrified and exhausted, she ends up shouting back at her own mother.
It's just horrific. And they even tried to force her to write a letter to her father, right? They wanted him to state in writing that he, quote, would not keep her at home.
Right, they were trying to manipulate her family into formally abandoning her to the organization.
It's incredibly sinister.
But her father was smart. He wrote back saying, "I will not try and keep you." That slight shift in phrasing denied them the ammunition they wanted, but it kept the door open for her.
So the ultimate physical escape happens in November 1983. And it was just sheer theater.
It had to be.
She was escorted by a numerary and a supernumerary on a 7.5-hour drive to her parents' house. And before going in, they gave her a 50-pound note to hide in her bra so she could run away if her parents tried to detain her.
They were basically funding an escape plan from her own family.
Yeah. So she walks into the house, and she has to put on this massive theatrical performance. She's screaming, "I want to follow my vocation," until her parents finally put their foot down and forcefully expelled the Opus Dei members from the house.
Her father told them to never come near her again. And physically, she was finally safe. But, and this raises an important question about the lingering nature of psychological prisons, the physical escape is often just the beginning of the ordeal.
Right, because she didn't actually feel free. From November 1983 until March 1985, Anmarie still mentally lived as an assistant numerary.
She was still in the system, in her head.
Exactly. And the organization continued to stalk her. They tracked her whereabouts, contacted her family, and constantly pressured her to return. There is one truly invasive incident that highlights how they viewed her.
The hospital incident.
Yes. They tracked her to an appointment at a public hospital. A numerary actually admitted to impersonating Anmarie over the phone to get her private medical location.
Which is illegal, by the way.
Right. And then that numerary showed up at the hospital and tried to physically pull Anmarie out of the waiting room, claiming a car and a priest were waiting outside.
That really proves they didn't see her as a former student who dropped out. They saw her as property.
They felt entitled to her physical body.
Exactly.
Which honestly contextualizes another detail in the research that I found just absurd and deeply patronizing. This was earlier, but it highlights the control, the how to shower class after the Rome trip.
Oh, yes. That is a very telling detail.
They were in Rome, wearing donated wool skirts in the sweltering heat, doing all this heavy domestic labor for a massive conference. And afterward, a complaint came back to Ireland that the Irish assistant numeraries were, quote, grubby. So the directors literally held a class to teach these adult women how to shower, complete with instructions on exactly where to apply shower gel. It's so infantilizing.
It is, but it is entirely by design.
How so?
If you can convince an adult woman that she does not even know how to wash herself properly, you are attacking her most basic sense of autonomy.
Oh, I see.
You reinforce her complete dependency on the institution for every single aspect of her existence. When you have been conditioned to believe you can't even shower correctly without their instruction, the mental chains remain long after you walk out the door.
That makes total sense. And it took years of distance for Anmarie to finally break those mental chains. And fascinatingly, the turning point for her was education.
Yes.
While working in the prison service, she began learning about prisoners' rights. And that led her to read the International Code of Human Rights. It was reading that document years later that allowed her to finally name what had happened to her. She realized she had suffered severe breaches of her human rights as a child, as a woman, and as a human being.
The vocabulary of human rights gave her the framework to dismantle the theological gaslighting she had endured.
That's a great way to put it.
And the final piece of her healing was breaking the silence. A chaplain encouraged her to speak out, and after 2 decades of feeling like she was the only one, she started finding the other Irish former NACs.
There are 6 of them now in contact in Ireland, alongside dozens in Argentina and across the world. Anmarie said that participating in the Financial Times investigation and sharing their stories with each other has been completely transformative. As she put it, knowledge is power and the truth will set you free.
Which brings us to a crucial point about why these testimonies matter. Institutions, whether they are religious, corporate, or governmental, they only become healthier and more ethical when criticism can be spoken openly and heard clearly.
Right. Suppressing these stories in the name of protecting an institution's reputation only guarantees that the abuse will continue.
Exactly.
Anmarie's story is more than one woman's account of her years in Opus Dei. When similar experiences emerge across different lives, different countries, and different decades, we have to ask whether we are looking at isolated events or at something structural. The domestic work, the lack of economic independence, the surrender of personal choice, and the way obedience, vocation, and service became intertwined are themes that have appeared repeatedly in the testimonies of former assistant numeraries. In our next episode, we will hear from another former assistant numerary, this time in Spain. Her story is her own, and we invite you to listen without assuming the conclusion, but also without ignoring the patterns that may emerge when these voices are heard together. One testimony tells us what happened to one person. Many testimonies can reveal how a system worked.
To our listeners, if you found value in this discussion, please subscribe to the channel, like the episode, and share it with others. Leave a comment with your thoughts, and be sure to follow the podcast for future episodes.
In our next episode, we'll go to the story of Fatima, who was also part of Opus Dei in Spain as Numerary assistant.
As we close today, there is one last haunting detail from Anmarie's testimony that I think warrants deep reflection. She described how, when the pressure became too much and a young woman finally broke and left the center, she would just disappear overnight.
Wow.
The next morning, there would simply be an empty chair at the dining table, and that person's name was never spoken again. They were entirely erased from the community's history, as if they had never existed. It challenges us to ask, in any organization, corporate or religious, what does it say about a culture when the price of leaving is the total erasure of your existence?
My blessings on the center line, count my losses in the passing pines. If every wrong turn still somehow led me here to you, guess I can't complain when I look back through this back road rear view. First scar on my knuckle from a fire